Good evening. Welcome to the third session of the Columbia Summer Ideas Exchange. I'm Steve Cohen, a professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and the Senior Vice Dean of the Columbia School of Professional Studies. For those who joined us for the last event, welcome back. For those who are joining for the first time, I'll offer a brief introduction. The Ideas Exchange is an important part of our co-curricular community programming this summer. Through this series, we can convene with our senior scholars and with professional journalists around some of the critical topics of the day. As we convene in cyberspace tonight, let's acknowledge that here in America, we're experiencing a deeply troubling combination of disease, racism, unemployment, abuse of power, and inadequate, incompetent, and even frightening leadership. We may not be able to meet on campus today, but as a community, we continue to connect with each other, to collaborate, to discuss our work, and to engage with our faculty and students. For more information on all the exciting events and courses at Columbia this summer, please visit summer.sps.columbia.edu. Tonight, we're extremely fortunate to have with us Professor Josef Sorett. Professor Sorett is an associate professor of religion here at Columbia and is director of the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. His work is extremely important work and explores ideas about how religion informs our broader culture and society, especially in Black communities. He's the author of numerous books, including Spirit in the Dark, A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics. He's currently working on a book about religion and hip hop. Also with us tonight is Darnell L. Mr. Moore is an award-winning author whose memoir, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age Black and Free in America, won the 2019 Lambda Literary Award and was a New York Times notable book. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Nation, and Ebony. Currently, he serves as Director of Inclusion Strategy for Content and Marketing at Netflix. Darnell Moore is also a profoundly influential activist, both for the LGBTQ community and is one of the early founding architects of Black Lives Matter. Welcome to you both. I'm looking forward to tonight's conversation and now turn this over to Darnell L. Moore.
Hello, everybody, wherever you might be tuning in from around the world. I'm really honored to be in conversation today with Professor Sorett and really in particularly in this moment where we need as many opportunities as possible to think about the times we are in and their connections to times past and also to the futures that we're attempting to sort of move into. Josef, we have limited time and I want to jump right in because there's so much we have to hear and learn from you. And I actually want to start by grounding us in the context of the times in which we're having this conversation. In many ways, we are having a conversation about hip hop, Black religiosity, spirituality, art, the connections between art and culture and Black life, in what we might call a storm within a storm. We are literally in the midst of uprisings that have been a response to old inequities that have been exacerbated also in a pandemic. So let's just start by setting the context. Give us some more, I want to give you a moment to talk about the moment that we're in and just to ground us before we jump into some other questions.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Darnell, for being here for this conversation. I want to thank SPS and Columbia for hosting this space, as well as everyone else who's in for the conversation. We look forward, I know, to the question and answer period as well, to opening it up. So certainly, I think, you know, in light of this moment, perhaps the most popular language that has shown up over the last 3 or 4 months has been unprecedented, right? When we think about COVID and the pandemic, and certainly there is something new in this moment, but I think especially in the context of thinking about something like the course I'm teaching this summer on African American studies, those of us who've been thinking about this are not surprised, right? There's so much that is not new. We can think about the long history of racial exclusion that we've been, that has fomented the rebellions, riots, uprisings, however we might want to name the protests of the last few weeks, that there is something that is part of a much longer tradition of response and speaking back to a long history of white supremacy as it took the form of enslavement, the strong history of protest, the long Black freedom struggle up through Jim Crow segregation, and even as we get to what folks call the movement into the promised land with the passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s, and we think about the rubrics tonight around hip hop, it's impossible to imagine this music without thinking about the riots and rebellions of the 1960s and 1968 in the aftermath of King's assassination, right? So there is so much that would seem to be unprecedented, but there's a way in which the African-American story is about a long flowing movement that responds in particular ways to moments like this that are new yet strangely familiar.
Yeah, I appreciate that this long sort of arc of a history of struggle, and certainly we see these continual iterations, right? But now we are in this particular iteration, this particular moment in which the struggle is happening within the context of a range of new media technologies, a range of different tools that can be used to not only facilitate conversations such that we can continue to be outright and loud about the injustices, to push forth political ideas, but also tools for which we can congregate in space. Tools, and this is a particular moment for which we have been forced in many ways to rely on technologies to do things like building connections, building community, establishing joy, getting the word out. So talk about the way that this space has also been used, or at least we can identify how the tools like social media can be really, really useful in moments like this, particularly as it relates to the proliferation of art and culture and things like hip hop. I'm thinking, for instance, of how we've taken to Instagram to have to congregate live parties. DJs like DJ Nice. If you all don't know, DJ Nice is a hip hop DJ who has what he calls Club Quarantine, which has had everyone from Michelle Obama to Oprah Winfrey to people like my sisters down in Camden, hundreds of thousands of people who are congregating on Instagram around using hip hop as a tool to build community. Can you talk a bit about the power of these tools and this space through which we're now using culture to bring people together?
Absolutely. And I think, like, to foreground the novelty of social media and new media that cuts in both directions, right? Because we think about the way in which, like, public killings of Black men and women have captured the national attention. And sort of one of the ironies is that the numbers by most studies would say that these killings are down, right? But yet we can't look away from them now. Now they're captured. And so while folks could look away from the lynch mob at night, no one can turn away, right? We can think about even the encounter last week in Central Park between Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, no relation, that no one can look away from that now. So social media puts these things front and center. So this is something that is new, and that, to your point, right, again, another aspect of the sort of long freedom struggle is of making something out of the tools that are presented, making something out of nothing, right? And so whether it's Club Quarantine, whether it's Verses, I think of, right, especially in the, the early weeks of COVID, as many of us were losing loved ones, a host of Zoom memorials where folks made church outside of church as there were public debates about not gathering in physical churches, this idea of making congregating, right, outside of formal religious institutions. And this is also, right, the history of hip hop, right? When public schools are being defunded of their art programs, folks make music with what's at their disposal. And so I think to see what D Nice is doing with Club Quarantine, to see what's going on at Verses, I think it was just this past Sunday that Verses' first iteration of a gospel session, featuring Kirk Franklin and Fred Hammond, right, focusing, right, actually taking Verses to church in a literal sense, if you will. Like, this is, again, something extremely new that responds in unique ways to this time. But this is also part of the long Black experience in the Americas, right? Of taking the tools that are at one's disposal to make community, to affirm oneself, and to speak to one another. And in this moment, all the more as many of us are still isolated within our homes.
As you talk, I think about Robin D.G. Kelley, the historian, whose book, Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination.
Absolutely.
The argument in that book is all about how in so many ways, we think about social movements, radical social movements, as being bereft of the power of art and culture. And what he's arguing is that for Black liberation movements, art, culture have been pivotal engines in moving those forward. And you alluded to this, but I want to talk a little bit more about hip hop as a galvanizing force. There's ways that many of us might think about hip hop only in a way that popular sort of media outlets across the sort of decades have glamorized it as something other than virtuous, as something other than virtuous. But speak to hip hop in terms of its place within its historical arc as a tool that was actually used to galvanize people, to pull people to organize, to sort of be an outlet for rage and pain and expression. The good uses of hip hop in ways that has not always been explored within popular culture.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is the story both in its local history, right? We think about, as I've already mentioned, the sort of emergence of what are referred to as post-industrial ghettos, as white flight in the aftermath of those 1960s rebellions, right? That resources leave the city and you have young folks who are excluded as the Cross Bronx's expressway is bulldozed through, destroying neighborhoods in the Bronx, right? That young people find a way to make themselves heard. Often the language, right? Folks have been appealing to King in his interpretation of the riots as the voice of the unheard, that this is also part of the long history of hip hop, insisting on articulating one's voice when folks have excluded or rendered you invisible. So that's certainly part of the long history of hip hop. And then I think especially as hip hop is capturing a national attention in the 80s with the emergence of so-called gangster rap, right? That all of hip hop is flattened out as sort of a voice of nihilism. Young Black people are framed as sort of having departed from the ways of their forebears. A sort of generational divide is diagnosed between the civil rights generation and the hip hop generation. But even in those moments that hip hop artists are partnering with local leaders, with national leaders, you think of the emergence of a hip hop political convention, you think of the history of vote or die campaigns, right, that are attempting to mobilize not just the music, but hip hop generations, which is, right, part of a long tradition of artists using their platform, using their voice to speak up and to speak truth to power. Absolutely. Hip hop is very much part of that tradition, even if that was so often interpreted in the early years as an enemy of that tradition.
And what's even more interesting about your research, I would like to sort of move us there for a bit, is the connections and interconnections between hip hop, Black Christianities, and sort of the history of Black Americans has been underexplored, right? So first, why your interest, in studying hip hop and religion, the connections between those two, and then sort of what are you hoping to uncover in your book?
Right. So obviously, this is in some ways a very personal story. As a young man, a young Black man who grew up on hip hop, my birth year, 1973, is the same year that folks often cite as the birth of hip hop, when cool DJ Herc is partying, right, spinning up at that party on Sedgwick Avenue, right? So this is a music that I grew up on, but I also grew up for most of my adolescence when both of my parents became born again Christians in a world that drew that line hard and fast, often between sacred and secular music, right? And so that religious world made a claim on me in a particular way that sort of put a moment of choice before me between my, purchasing my first Run DMC album, purchasing Lottie Dottie, this first single that had warning sexually explicit lyrics before Tipper Gore's parental advisory campaign, right? So there was a way in which the moral compass that I was being sort of raised in this church required a decision of me of sorts. And I think, man, I wish that a figure like Chance, who moved in and out of sacred and secular between hip hop and gospel in many ways, would seem to in spaces flatten out the difference. I wish an artist like that had been available there. So on a personal level, this is something I've been wrestling with. And then the more recent, for many years, and then the more recent centrality of Christianity within hip hop sort of forced my hand to say, you know what, I've been thinking about it. I'd written small pieces. Now is the time to actually really take this on more full speed. And I think while it would seem obvious now with Kanye Sunday services, with Chance's coloring book, you think of the religious themes throughout so many, the explicitly Christian themes within so many artists, lesser and more well-known ones, that in fact, the long history of hip hop is impossible to understand, right? Despite the music being cast as somehow profane, as somehow the music of a group of young people who had been alienated from Black churches from the outset. Religion, whether it's from Five Percenters in the Nation of Islam to the more recent prominence, a sort of post-Jesus Walks moment, religion is hidden in plain sight throughout so much of the music, but because of the very sort of mainstream framing of the music that so many of us also have had to sort through, we not much has been said. And there is a growing body of scholarship. I think of great work. I think of Suad Abdul Kabir's great book on Muslim Cool. I think of a lot of work done in a theoretical frame of religion and hip hop by figures like Anthony Penn at Rice or Monica Miller at Lehigh. There's folks doing this work, but yet I think how to place all these different threads in conversation and tell a story about the religious history of hip hop that also can speak to a range of different audiences.
Which brings us to Summer Ideas and this course that you're teaching. Talk about what interventions you hope to make through the course, what students you are hoping, what you're hoping that they gain from it. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is often the risk when you throw hip hop in the title of a course. Some students are gonna just want to show up and listen to rap music for 2 hours, how often? And there is a lot of music, and the music in itself is worthy of academic inquiry, right? And I think we're beyond a moment that one needs to make the justification for why study hip hop, right? Whether through the longevity or the creativity, the music and its contribution to the world and to the nation is, I think, quite evident. At the same time, as we're studying the music often also provides a really rich texture of primary sources for thinking about the way in which religion and race are entangled in this period of time from roughly 1970 to the present, right? The post-civil rights age, the post-racial age, but also, right, the moment that present us with Black Lives Matter, which you yourself, right, played a central role in. I'm curious, right, to think about for you how hip hop, I'd love to hear how for you hip hop and other musics shaped your own identity as both a writer and an activist. But I think hip hop helps us think not just about the musics and our soundtracks, but the various spiritual, social, and cultural worlds that we've grown up in over the last 4+ decades.
Yeah, I'm actually, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the history of my city. I was born and raised in Camden, New Jersey. And it's interesting, my mother wrote me 2 days ago saying that she's triggered because so many of the images of the uprising that she's experienced in the streets of Camden and Philly is reminiscent of the sort of moments of unrest that literally had Camden burning.
Yep.
One of which was a moment in which they were asked to put red, black, or green pieces of cloth on the outside of the doors to signify that these were homes that were occupied by Black folk. And she was able to resonate, connect to the rage that was at the heart. In that moment in 1971, a Puerto Rican man was killed by police in Camden after he had been stopped by 2 white police officers. And what's interesting about that is precisely is the moment where hip hop is about to be like it's being birthed.
Absolutely.
And I actually recall, the Sugar Hill Gang. I'm thinking about these artists that my mom would play as I was a kid. I was born in 1976, so I came in into the early 80s listening to these songs that were so much about trying to sort of seep into the interiority of Black and Latinx folks' lives, particularly within urban spaces in the Northeast, that were in post-industrial places, that had felt the squeeze, right, of not only white racial supremacy, but the calculated political and economic decisions that turned many of our homes into the ghettos that other people scandalize, are called ghettos.
Absolutely.
And how these rap artists took, in many ways, we're offering an analysis through art of their context. And it's no different than this moment that we're in. I mean, part of so much of the movement for Black Lives, what happened at the Ferguson uprising and all of what was sort of energizing that so this was a hip hop generation, people who had been birthed into hip hop, who had been shaped in many ways. I think I would call it sort of through a philosophy that's been embedded through hip hop, that in some ways argues for an articulation of Black agency,
Yeah.
of the mattering of Black lives, that speaks back, in some ways subversive, in other ways very upfront. And you think about Kendrick Lamar's "We Gonna Be All Right," that was like a theme song. I'm not even certain that he imagined that to be a song that was to catalyze a movement. And that was a song that organizers and activists and everyday folk played in the middle of what we might want to call it the fire, and how impactful that was, right? So, but given that, like, music has had many functions within the context of African-American culture and life and history. What are some of the major influences, the sort of genealogies that you're looking at in the book, that you're drawing from in the book that you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, you're to locate, I mean, I was thinking of a number of things as I was actually recalled to the pages of your book in the work in which you historicize, right? This term now ghetto that gets thrown around, but the work you do to texture the lives, right, that are mapped under this sort of blanket statement about what's happening in cities around the country. And I want to, again, as you're interested, I'd love to hear more of your thinking about that. But as we think about hip hop in and of itself, it is, on one hand, telling that story, right? So alongside Rapper's Delight, which foregrounds this impulse towards pleasure, towards the party, the celebratory nature, which is just as much a need in this moment as it is in, right, moments where folks aren't in the street. You have alongside that another early single, right, The Message, right, that would seem, right, to capture the sort of political impulse of that generation, to speak about what's happening in the Bronx, what's happening in Harlem in that moment. And so the history of Black cultural expression in its relationship to Black political movements that are responding to white supremacy as it takes form in different moments in time and space is front and center as we think about hip hop as an extension of this long tradition. So when we think about the Black arts movement, right, as an aesthetic extension of Black power in the 1960s, where poetry that even in that moment was often being recorded, right, sometimes over gospel tracks. I think of Nikki Giovanni's work with gospel choirs, or The Last Poets, right, or Langston Hughes, right, that in the 1960s, we see this play between art and politics that is coming up with novel musical forms, right, to speak to a multitude of audiences. Think about in the Harlem Renaissance, even if it's not coming together in the same way, right, that folks are responding to riots in the at Red Summer of 1919, right, the sort of the aftermath of World War I, the tensions in cities there, that we have literary production alongside political activism in the aftermath of World War I. And that's very much the tradition going back to the turn of the 20th century, where we see Jim Crow segregation coded in the law with Plessy versus Ferguson. The rise of a new Negro is as much a literary moment as it is a political movement. So those things have long been tied. And I think, right, especially as it relates to the artists, right, the insistence on freely telling the entirety of the Black story, right, often pushing back against what, say, race leaders think ought to be presentable, right, that Langston Hughes and his Declaration of Artistic Freedom is declaring that, right, Black folk, we are beautiful and ugly too, right, deemed ugly by what sense, right? And so I think about hip hop as it often was not pretty in its presentation. Hip hop as it often magnified some of the larger social ills around violence, misogyny, sexism. These things are there as well. And so how do we tell the full story? I think your work helps us do this in so many ways, of the beauty of Black life in moments of crisis, a people made of and through in movements and in moments like this, but that also wrestles with these challenges, right, with ourselves, within the intramural, if you will.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I honestly been sitting here as you were talking, thinking about one of the reasons that hip hop has always been cast, and you said this, as profane. One, it's just because of the very clear demarcations that's drawn between what we understand to be the sort of secular, the sacred, the spiritual, and the worldly. you know, to talk about these ideas like human life and sexual bodies and sex.
Yep.
And is to somehow to not be also thinking through or talking about what we might understand as spirit. And then there, along the way have come a range of critiques about hip hop. Overwhelmingly so, people have named it as being patriarchal, sort of like shaped by sexism and misogyny, and
Yep.
ways that we have. And for some reason, I often have always read that critique as scandalous,
Mm.
because it overwhelmingly reads into this cultural production. All of these sort of isms, these sexism and misogyny and patriarchy, and assumes that this cultural production has not been made within the context of a country that itself
Absolutely.
has been
Yes.
driven on and founded upon ideas of sexism, misogyny, and so much else. Even more so, as if it's a cultural production, unlike some others, rock and roll, country music, whatever else, that
Yep.
itself, those cultural productions somehow are freed from the critique of also
Yep.
having forms of its music that is also sexist and patriarchal, misogynistic, which is not to make an excuse for hip hop, but it is to raise the question of why it is that hip hop, right,
Yep.
gets to be the sort of beholder of that type of critique in ways that we don't allow for other musical forms that are traditionally not coming out of Black community. That said, like, I wonder if you can speak to that a bit and that conundrum. Because part of why I think it's so interesting, or one, people resist hip hop as a cultural production that has weight and value and beauty, is because it's Black. Because it also came out of the life worlds of Latinx folk within places like Bronx, and because of that gets overly read as sort of non-virtuous in ways that we don't really apply to a lot of other genres. And I wonder if you can sort of talk about that a bit.
Yeah, this is right, a perfect instance of another obvious connection between the way in which folks read hip hop and the way in which folks read Black religion vis-a-vis the Black church, right? That these deeply American institutional and cultural forms are become the scapegoat for all that is wrong with American culture, right? We think about the way in which on the moment that Obama's elected president in 2008, right, galvanizing a hip hop generation in some ways, Prop 8 is passed for the first time, and we know why it's passed, right? Legislation says, oh, well, this is because Black folk are overly allegiant to their churches and therefore they're hyper homophobic. When what's more homophobic than American Christianity writ large, right? There are major denominations within the context of the United States that can't find a way to stay together, right? But it's Black folks who are the problem, right? So the same reading onto hip hop of hip hop's homophobia, which isn't to say that Black folk don't have, right? Black cultural forms don't have their issue, but there's this sort of pairing of a fascination, attraction to the authenticity associated with Black cultural production and performances at the same time that is discarded and is, right, figured as all that's wrong that we can't own above ourselves. The violence, the whatever it might be, we just map it on to what Black folk are doing there, even as we're consuming it, right, as a guilty pleasure, if you will. Yeah, this absolutely.
And I'm interested then, like, who of the artists today, like, are there some that exist that you think exemplify like this confluence of religious or spiritual thought, contemporary hip hop, that come to mind for you?
I mean, obviously, as I mentioned before, and you know, warning, I'm going to flip this back to you because I want to hear your thoughts on this as well. I mean, for me, again, you know, it's interesting on two levels, right? One hand, obviously, Jesus Walks was a game changer, and we could, you know, everybody talks about we like the old Kanye, the new Kanye. At the descriptive level, right? There's a way in which what he did with Jesus Walks was just different, right? To lead, like there are references to Jesus throughout hip hop in different kinds of ways, but to lead with Jesus is right? And he descriptively played it well, right? He's going to frame Jesus as, right, the forbidden product, right? They say it's going to take away from my spins, but maybe it'll take away from my sins. And a sort of whole new set of moments. But in that same year, you have, right, Ja Rule, who's partnering with Ashanti on Rule 3 16, right, which is basically renaming the Gospel of John after him, right? In that song, while it's all about pimping, is fundamentally dependent on this hook that nods to this Black church adage, right? American Christianity adage that God may not come when you want him, but he's always on time, right? And so this sort of gendered and sexuality rubric, right, narrative is rendered in the familiar refrain of the Black church. I mean, there's obviously, again, as I said, I think chants, Kendrick Lamar, these folks do it. There's just a whole host. There's almost too many, but you please help me fill in the gap.
You know, I instantly, and by the way, if you're tuned in, please do send us questions. We would love to pose some questions here and engage you all in conversation. And as we wait for those, a few more questions for you, Josef, but I instantly, you know, I keep thinking about that often is sort of left out of this sort of genealogy is Lauryn Hill.
Yes, yep.
Lauryn Hill's album, her first album, her solo album, was such a remarkable example of hit. Like, so Lauryn Hill, for those who don't know, is like formerly of the Fugees, right? Like, is this artist, Black woman artist.
Another one from New Jersey.
Yes, who emerges on the scene as a member of an all-male group, and she's a Black woman on there, and who does a solo album that is so, it's so many ways shaped by not only Black Christian tradition, but it is tapping into a type of spirituality that was like new for its time. Absolutely. It was so new for its time. That one, she comes to mind as one of those folk who were so instrumental in like shaking up, you know what I mean? Like infusing in the music something that we hadn't really seen before.
Absolutely, and revising, remixing, whether it's adopting this classic hymn, right, Marching to Zion, as an ode to her newborn son. When I go back to that moment, it's amazing how, like, listening to Lauryn Hill, listening to an artist also brings us back to these concrete moments, because now I'm flashing back, also thinking about Baduism, right? It's sort of the blurring the lines between neo soul and hip hop, right? And think about her collaborations on that album with folks like Pete Rock and others, right? But that Erykah Badu Baduism takes me back to this particular moment early in 1997 when I'm in North Carolina. I can immediately see the moment when this new sound, right, is there, right? It was amazing, right, to think about, again, some of your earlier questions about congregating, the conversation she was having on Versus just a few weeks ago about, and how her and Jill Scott modeled something different in that space of affirmation, but also that sort of, not in a neatly marked religiosity, but a sort of spiritual space that affirmed, right, who they were as individuals, the long trajectory of what their music brought, right, to so many. I think someone like Erykah Badu's debut with Baduism in 96, 97 as well.
I want to play a bit of a sort of like throwback to memory lane, but I mean, I'm instantly thinking about as a young person growing up in the 80s, you know, I mentioned Sugar Hill Gang, Biz Markie, Big Daddy Kane, LL Cool J, Kwame, Special Ed, Queen Latifah, Roxanne, are those, I mean, I can go even Ghetto Boys as you get to sort of like the early '90s. I mean, these folk were so instrumental to like, in both, and let me be clear, in ways that were really good and also in ways that had me rethink notions of manhood, that had me not only rethink but critique notions of manhood that had been sort of proliferated through some of the music, that
Absolutely.
challenged me to think more concretely and more intricately about queerness, you know? But this music, it provided me sort of space to raise questions, not only about the world, but also about self. You know, I was coming of age as a Black, queer, young person in the age of AIDS, in the epicenter of hip hop, in a Northeast urban center. And like these musics, in many ways were like the places through which young people congregated, where we found meaning and also critique and also raised question. What music for you for that sort of era? What were those sort of frames for you that were instrumental?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think about being in Boston, being in Roxbury, where in 7th grade and purchasing, right, these, whether it's Run DMC, right, right, Prosperity Preacher Run, right, before he has his own reality TV show and has a conversion experience. I think about Run DMC, I think about Special Ed, I think Tribe Called Quest was a staple for me, right, sort of as I was going through my own spiritual journey, my own religious coming of age, putting down certain music. And then in the early 90s, mid 90s, as I was working with young people after college, picking up Tribe, picking up The Roots, going to Lyricist Lounge tours or OK Player tours, that sort of Black Star is sort of this consciousness sensibility, right? I think of so many of my friends, while never converting per se, took up 5%er names because there was this different vision of what it meant, right, to be Black. To be right, to have a sense of racial consciousness, right? Even at a place like Oral Roberts University, where I was at college in the first half of the 90s, we're drawing on Brand Nubian and others to sort of rethink what it meant to be 25% of the student body there, but not see our experience represented within the university. So hip hop, any number of artists gave us a language and a set of experiences for making sense of, right, the way in which race took on form in the variety of spaces I saw myself moving in and out of. So absolutely.
I want to take a question from, and I hope I'm getting the name right, from Kyra Azor, who was a prospective student who asks, the Black church has always been critical of secular or worldly music, which hip hop falls under. What impact do you think that has on hip hop artists like Kanye trying to cross over and be accepted by the community?
This is a great question. I think it's a great question. And Darnell, you have a whole bunch of experience in youth ministry as well. So perhaps you might weigh in here after I offer some preliminary thoughts. I mean, I think certainly there is this larger narrative, right, of hip hop in the church and opposition that still would seem to persist even in this moment in which Sunday service and chants are doing these really interesting things. Yet I think along the way, there were always spaces in which those lines were being transgressed, right? That the first commercially released Christian rap song is as early as 1985, right? And so we think about sort of churches as they're struggling to stay relevant to a new generation, are also taking risks and experimenting with new musical forms, right? That's in fact a long history of gospel music going back to the 1930s, right? And so it's what, now 3 or 4 decades between when Stephen Wiley, right, an unknown rapper from Tulsa, or from actually from Muskogee, Oklahoma, of all the places, not associated with the birth or rise of hip hop, that in 2000 and I guess it was 14 or 16, that we have a Christian rapper like Lecrae who tops the Billboard 100. So I think, I mean, over time, there's been an increased willingness by churches to experiment with new musical forms, which is part of the struggle that is also familiar, right? Of what of the new that is currently framed as secular, because it's outside of seen as outside of the church tradition, is going to be embraced as churches try to stay relevant in a contemporary moment. So yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to that as well, Darnell, from your experience.
You know, as a church boy, you know, I grew up a church boy, and I lived through those years where a lot of the church, just for context, I was brought up in sort of fundamentalist Pentecostal apostolic traditions. So, you know, music was music was a very contested topic. I mean, not even certain gospel songs, they sound too secular leaning, too much like the songs on the radio. If they had too much of an R&B vibe, if they had too much of like, you know, folk were really thoughtful about that, and not only thoughtful, but warned us about that. But like you, I watched churches not only think about what the needs of young people were. I think many of the church leaders understood that they were trying to communicate to young people and failing at it, partially because the young people were using different, you know, we were listening to hip hop, young people they were listening to other, you know, other forms of music that were not just sort of the traditional way, the music that we were listening to. And many churches adapted. But then I think, you just mentioned this, but I think about people, like, even outside of hip hop, you think about like the Clark sisters, whose biopic you all should probably watch if you haven't, on Lifetime, and the struggles as members of a Pentecostal church congregation, Church of God in Christ, when they remade a song, You Brought the Sunshine, which had hooks from Stevie Wonder laced throughout the tracks.
Absolutely.
And people were upset.
That was enough to get you called backslid, right?
Yes, you getting, set down, and like, literally their mother, Mattie Moss Clark, was berated because of that. So but I want to be clear about, and you can talk a bit more about this too, about these sort of responses from a lot of these Black African-American denominational churches to like the resistances to the musics, to the resistances to sort of like letting in what they understood to be these influences that could have moved them away from respectable posture that so many Black churches were trying to live into. Evelyn Higginbotham, right? She talks about this stuff, like this idea that there was such a desire to present to white America and to America in general, that the church folk, the Black church folk, could live up to a respectable it was actually a survival strategy. Right?
Absolutely, yes.
So it isn't just like it isn't the case that Black churches were just limited in its ability to sort of be expressive and to sort of think about other ways of sort of expressing worship. A lot of that has to do with survival, right? A mechanism of sort of appealing to this narrative of respectability. So I think that it's important to sort of name that too, because that's often the case where we can sort of have a really low reading of Black church traditions, as if these church traditions lack analyses, or as if they lack a type of cultural sensitivity. We know that gospel music is sort of like the best gospel music from James Cleveland and everyone else was totally shaped by R&B, soul, and so many other influences. And the churches were getting down with that.
Absolutely, right? It's the public pitting against of these two ideas of sacred versus secular is real, but the way it's lived out is much more messy, right? And I love the fact that you point to this discourse around respectability, right? That Evelyn Higginbotham helps us think with, and that has almost in some ways become persona non grata, right? But it's never that these Black churches were trying to be white, right? That this is actually a strategy with some constraints, but it's about making a claim for inclusion and equality, right? And I think, right, that I think of that legendary moment where Calvin Butts, as sort of, right, as pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, is calling for a public steamrolling of gangster rap. And it's not so, right, it's because it's perceived as presenting Black people in a way that is going to undermine the cause of racial justice. Whether we should be flattening out hip hop with actually the lived experiences of Black and brown young people is another story, right? But there's a sort of strategic argument about representations of Blackness and what that means for the well-being of actual Black people, right? And so, I mean, so I think you're right to highlight the degree to which respectability is a concrete survival strategy that is mobilized to produce a certain set of ends that also has its own limitations. I think that's an excellent point. Darnell, I don't know if it's all right, I'd love to ask you a question as we think about,
sure.
Because there's a number of different ways to read the way in which churches embrace hip hop, right? Right. I think that like within certain white evangelical spaces, there was almost a moment where, you had to be able to, white youth ministers had to be able to play acoustical guitar, right? Sort of fashion themselves after folk rock singers. And then there's a certain moment where you would think like a skill for being a youth pastor in a Black church is some facility with hip hop. Might not have to be a rapper, but right. And so there's a way in which, right, that it could be read as sort of condescending, like as if Black young people only listen to hip hop and not to rock, right, a whole range of genres, some of which might be considered white, right? And that somehow hip hop was going to be a panacea to make a church relevant to a new generation. I think about outside of just hip hop in your own work within the context of organizing, theorizing Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives, right? You made mention of how Kendrick Lamar's song does mobilize it, but now I think we have a new generation of folks, like what will be the anthem for these movements, right? What are, and I know it's been several years since doing Black youth, since doing youth ministry, but I know you still mentor, right? Folks, what do you think, what kinds of questions do you see young folk asking now, whether of the music, in the music, but also, right, in this moment of mobilization?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. For me, it seems to me that, and maybe this is questions that have been asked before and tested by Black creatives, Black cultural producers, but so many young people, I think, or what I assess, are really blowing up and testing the sort of limited nature of like essentialist understandings of Black youth culture. They're saying like, like I think about Tyler the Creator, and these are folk that are saying like, okay, I can rap. I will also like sing, and not just sing like R&B. Like I will tap into a range of different sort of mixed genres.
Yep.
So it's almost as if they're blowing up these sort of boundaries that are often limited by our racialized understandings of what Black young people ought to be and how they ought to express.
Yep.
And if you notice, like there's a way that the music is so it's moving us beyond the limitations of even what we imagine hip hop to be. I don't think Tyler, I'm continuing to go to Tyler Creator because he's like first of mind as an example of, we probably would have had questions around if that was hip hop, if that had come out.
Absolutely.
Right? Like 10 years ago even. And now it's understood because we've had a generation that has also expanded the genre in ways that Black people have always done, and blended into that genre other forms of music that is not just like, and I want to be clear, like to say like Tyler moving into pop or like whoever, these are forms of musical expression and genres that Black folk have always dabbed into and shaped, right?
Absolutely.
And that to me is sort of like the texture of this moment, that there are all of the, folk are like, indie artists who are like not relying on corporate studio executives and A&R reps to sell them as products, who are choosing instead to go other routes, like through social media, to gain millions of listeners, to develop a career such that they don't have to be pigeonholed into becoming something other than what they want to be. That to me is sort of the freedom that I see, right? Like in a moment like this, that is pretty remarkable. It's pretty remarkable.
No, absolutely. And I think this is right. There's a way in which hip hop has always carried the weight of being more than just music, right? There's a way in which the music is made to stand in for the experience of Black and brown young people. And certainly the music tells a story or tells a whole host of stories. But I think especially over the last several years, that what you've just observed is sort of as a effort to bust those boundaries of genre, whereas, right, hip hop becomes mapped as urban music, which of course we know is code word for Black music. Right. But what someone like Tyler, the Creator, even this is, again, what's also interesting about Chance is part of what he's able to blur the lines between, resist the push, even though he's named Chance the Rapper, by streaming, to record an album that is tough to distinguish between gospel and hip hop. He's also able to do that because he's able to sing and rap in ways, right, that other artists who try to do this cannot quite do as, right, successfully. So I think certainly like part of the tradition of hip hop and of Black artistic and cultural expression is about taking on the categories that one has inherited, but then also blowing them up in interesting sort of ways, right? So that the art, like all art, ought not just be understood as a flat expression of who the artist is, right? It is an expression of who they are, but not in a way that's mapped onto a particular racial identity in predictable kind of ways.
Yes. Oh wow! Listen, we can talk about. I want this conversation to go on. Let me get these two questions in.
Sure
This one
thing.
is from an alum, Beatrice Tyrion. Apologies if I'm messing up names. Who asked, "How can hip hop and religion bring hope to all of us? Which hip hop artists do this now?" I mean, a second question you sort of hinted at, but I think this question is right on, particularly given this moment. How can hip hop and religion bring hope to all of us?
Pop and religion bring hope to us. Yeah, especially in a moment when hip hop is, I mean, when religion, right, is being made into, right, a soundbite. I mean, again, we think about all the conversations of President Trump's, right, clearing of a crowd, in fact, pellet gun shooting of protesters just so he can stand in front of church that he has no permission to be at, right? And again, I don't even want to distract the conversation by giving that too much air, but I do think about the ways in which, in this particular instance, the religious leaders who are responsible for that, the church over that diocese, the Episcopal bishop spoke very clearly to say, right, the Christianity we believe in denounces that use of our property. The Christianity we believe in sides with the least of these, sides with the protesters, sides with Black and brown folk, sides with queer folk, right? So I think within the context of religion more broadly, within the context of Black Christianity, I think folks who are on that side are always perhaps a minority, right? A voice in the wilderness, speaking truth to power. But I think that there are any number of folks, like you see the faces of clergy who are with the protesters, not necessarily needing to lead, right? And then I think, right, to our point earlier, that one not need be formally associated with a church to find spiritual or religious succor, drawing on the broader set of resources that don't map onto a neat religious orthodoxy. I think we can find that hope in the work that each of us are doing in different spaces. I think, yeah, I mean, those are, as it relates to religion. Within the context of hip hop, I mean, again, I think we could narrate this story through the mainstream, and it's easy to like look at the sort of creative work that artists, who get radio play, but there are vibrant local scenes, right, that are like supporting these movements. And we can think about, as has already been mentioned, the way that "We Gonna Be All Right" became an anthem. And so Kendrick Lamar thinking in real critical ways, or an artist who didn't get as much shine like Tefpo, who was very much grounded, right, in the St. Louis area, who's a rapper, but also is doing the organizing work. So I think there's too many examples. Those are a couple that immediately come to mind. Who
And
please, yeah.
a last question is from Lee Kong, who is asking this question via Facebook. What do you think about the religious tradition of hip hop and revolution? Whether through Rakim, are the early 5% influence rappers, are the newer version with Jay-Z and Jay Electronica? How is that relevant to the protests of today?
I mean, absolutely. We think of the long history of Black Islam, right? The varieties of Black Islam that are as much a part of the American story as other religious traditions, even if Christianity and Protestant Christianity has been so enmeshed in the dominant discourse, right? From the moment of enslaved Africans who came bringing Islam with them, right? We think of the narrative of Omar ibn Said and others, so many others, who maintained fidelity to their tradition even while negotiating the Christian land. But certainly the range of new religious forms, the Nation of Islam, the 5% Nation, which is, right, founded in 1968 by Clarence 13X and grows up with hip hop, that provides, right, Black young people with a different way of understanding their identity, that is concerned with narrating a Black story that doesn't begin or end with slavery. This is what we think of Rakim's songs. In many ways, they're 5% sermons, right? That he's talking about providing a new kind of Black consciousness to a new generation. This is what Erykah Badu's doing on Baduism, right? When she's talking about, I was born on the water with $3.06. You may laugh because you did not do your math. She's talking about the cipher, 360 degrees. It's a 5% sermon that is, right, meant to reorient a new generation. So I think by no means does Christianity gets the lion's share of the attention, but there's been a variety of Black religious traditions that have availed themselves of Islam, of African-derived religious traditions. I think of like the hip-hop group from Brazil, the Orishas, right? I mean, I think there are a whole host. There's I think the musical collaboration, Oshun, I think is the name of the Black women singers who are also like carrying on a tradition of African spirituality as part of their music, right? That there are a host of Black gods, if you will, if we want to look outside of Christianity for also a spiritual resource that is politically significant.
Well, I hate to even end. We have a final question, which is really a meditation. What brings you optimism at this point? What is sort of the source of your optimism? And I'll maybe answer that too, and then let you close us out. But for me, I have been most interested for folk who are able to take moments like this, which seem to be seemingly spectacular and exceptional, and connect the dots between the big fire that we might be experiencing now and the everyday fires that occur under our noses every day, the mundane structural inequities, the mundane microaggressions. Because often is the case, you know, we as a country get pulled into a sort of a feeling of rage and hopelessness, and we'll get activated, and then the news cycle will change. Another story will go off. This story, we'll forget about hashtag George Floyd, and then go back to the normal ways of being. What brings me optimism is that this pandemic, if nothing else, taught us that we cannot go back to normal. And if we go back to normal, we will not just likely, we will be exactly in this time loop that we find ourselves in. So what I'm optimistic about is that moments like this can propel us into something new, into a future ways of being that can take us away from all that we have learned to sort of be very comfortable with in our now.
Darnell, I think that's exactly right. I'm always sort of reluctant to use the word optimism, although I think it's a sort of willful optimism. And I think the source of hope is very much that, right? That there's a way in which some folks are immediately appealing to like COVID as the thing that is leveling us all. And we know that's not the case, right? Yes, it's impossible to imagine a normal that looked pre-COVID, but we can also see the ways in which these inequalities have been exacerbated. But I do think the fact that we are here, that in and of itself for me is hope, right? I think of, again, to go back to the song that you invoked first of We Gonna Be All Right, because we are here, because we have a chance to create something other than what we knew before, right? COVID has in many ways amplified and shined a light on this to so many folks who might otherwise have been willing to continue to look away, right? In the same way that killing of George Floyd, I think, right, although not caught on camera, Breonna Taylor and others, right, that it renews something that has been a constant news cycle since the last decade, but is part of the larger long cycle of this nation. And I think more and more folks are becoming aware that this is not just a news story, that this is a longer story, that there's something fundamentally broken, and we have to do something different. And so for me, the opportunity, the fact that we are still here, having lost so many, to try to do something new is itself the grounds for hope to do that work.
Professor Sorett, thank you for this conversation, for what you're doing in your research, for the space you've allowed students to enter into this summer, and just for your being. I appreciate being in conversation with you.
Likewise, Darnell, thank you for being here. It's always, even a space like this, right? To be in conversation with you and to learn from you so much every time we sit down, man. I appreciate it.